Todd Morgan had been living among them for years. No one suspected the quiet factory worker, the man with a friendly smile and a well-kept apartment, was hiding a monstrous secret. Detective Rachel Ward and her team had no idea the trail they were about to follow would uncover a twisted web of deception, manipulation, and unspeakable horror. As they dug deeper, they would find themselves facing one of the most chilling killers the small town of Maplewood had ever known. But as the truth began to surface, the question remained. How many more were out there, and could they stop the nightmare before it was too late? Todd Morgan was the kind of man who blended into the background. He lived in a small, aging apartment complex in Maplewood, a town that seemed to have been forgotten by time. The neighbors didn't know much about him. To them, he was just another face in the crowd, a quiet man who didn't seem to attract attention. He worked night shifts at a local packaging plant, handling boxes and machinery with robotic precision. His days were spent in a haze of sleep, and his nights in the hum of the factory, surrounded by people he didn't interact with. The building was old, with peeling wallpaper and the smell of stale air that seemed to linger in every corner. Despite the lack of luxury, it had been a decent enough place to live for someone like Todd. He had kept to himself, never participating in the building's events, never attending gatherings or barbecues that other residents seemed so fond of. No one knew much about his past, and no one asked. But things began to change in early March. It started with a faint, acrid odor that seemed to hang in the hallway. It was hard to pinpoint at first, a smell so strong and chemical that it made the air feel heavy. The residents complained to the building manager, Arvin Greel, who had grown used to the occasional tenant gripe. Arvin had been working at the complex for years, and he knew the drill: leaky faucets, broken lights, that sort of thing. But this was different. The smell was so strong that it couldn't be ignored. For 3 days, no one had seen Todd. He had become even more reclusive than usual. Neighbors said they hadn't heard the usual sounds of his apartment: the steady hum of a television, the rustling of papers, the clink of kitchen utensils. He had always been quiet, but now it seemed like he had disappeared altogether. Some thought it was just another case of someone keeping to themselves, but the smell, it was too much to ignore. On the 3rd day, Arvin made a decision. He would go up to Todd's apartment and check on him. He had keys to every unit in the building, and it was his job to handle any maintenance issues. When he knocked and received no answer, he tried the door. It was unlocked. As he stepped inside, the smell hit him full force, making his stomach churn. He hesitated, unsure of what he was about to find. The apartment was dark, the curtains drawn, as if someone had tried to block out the world. The usual clutter was missing. There were no discarded newspapers or empty coffee cups. Everything seemed meticulously placed, almost too perfect. But it didn't take long for Arvin to notice the oddity that stood out: a faint streak of dark liquid near the bathroom door. He slowly moved toward the bathroom, feeling uneasy. As he opened the door, his eyes widened in shock. The sight that greeted him was something he would never forget. Todd Morgan's body, barely recognizable, was lying in a bathtub, half submerged in what appeared to be a thick, greenish liquid. The body was in a state of advanced decomposition, but there was enough left to identify the man who had lived in this apartment just days before. His face was barely distinguishable, distorted beyond recognition, as though the flesh had been eaten away by something far more corrosive than natural decay. Arvin stumbled back, his heart racing. He had seen plenty of odd situations in his years as a building manager, but this was unlike anything he had encountered before. His first instinct was to leave, to run for help, but the chilling reality settled in. He couldn't leave the apartment like this. The scene was a crime scene, and he was standing right in the middle of it. Without touching anything else, Arvin rushed downstairs and called the police. Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance, signaling the arrival of law enforcement. As the officers stormed in and began to assess the situation, it became clear that this was no ordinary death. The smell, now a mixture of chemicals and decay, filled the air as detectives began to comb through the apartment. The scene seemed too organized, too deliberate. Whoever had done this had not only planned the murder, but had gone to great lengths to dispose of the body in a way that left few traces behind. The bathtub, the unusual liquid, everything pointed to a methodical killer, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. As the initial shock wore off, the questions started to pile up. Who was Todd Morgan? Why had he been targeted? And most haunting of all, who had the cold, calculated mind to orchestrate such a gruesome act? It was the beginning of a mystery that would take weeks to unravel, a mystery that would reveal a secret, life hidden beneath the surface of the quiet man from Unit 5C. The discovery of Todd Morgan's body set off a chain of events that no one in Maplewood could have ever imagined. The initial shock of his death quickly gave way to a growing sense of unease as more details began to surface. The apartment, once thought to be just the home of a quiet factory worker, was slowly revealing its dark secrets. The police and forensic teams had their work cut out for them. The decomposed body in the bathtub was just the beginning of an even more chilling investigation. At Nye. First, the authorities focused on the most obvious question: how had Todd Morgan died? The answer came quickly, but it was more unsettling than anyone could have anticipated. The medical examiner's report confirmed that the cause of death was not simply a natural accident or even an ordinary murder. Todd had been poisoned. Chaturshik forensic team found traces of a rare chemical compound in his bloodstream, a substance that was used in industrial settings but had no reason to be in a typical household. The poison had been introduced into his body well before he was placed in the acid bath, confirming that the acid itself hadn't killed him. The acid had only been a means of disposal, a way to erase the evidence of the murder. But who would have had the means and the motive to carry out such a methodical, premeditated act? As the investigation deepened, the unsettling truth began to emerge. Todd Morgan had been living a life that no one had suspected, a life filled with lies, deception, and an elaborate network of false identities. Detectives scoured the apartment for anything that could shed light on his past. The place had been surprisingly neat, almost too neat. It was as if Todd had gone out of his way to hide something. There were no personal items lying around, no photographs of family, no mementos of a past life. Instead, there were rows of plastic bins stacked neatly in one of the closets. The bins were labeled with dates, initials, and what appeared to be random numbers. At first glance, they seemed innocuous, but upon closer inspection, they revealed a pattern that sent chills down the detectives' spines. Inside, the bins were items that did not belong in a typical apartment. Expensive women's jewelry, watches, and various personal belongings were tucked away carefully, each item marked with a label and a corresponding date. Some items still bore bloodstains, and others had a disturbing sense of familiarity to them. But the most disturbing find was the pile of identification cards. Todd Morgan had been using multiple names. In one bin, there were IDs under the name Clint Vassell, a man who had supposedly lived in a small cabin in rural Wyoming. In another, the name Jared Densmith appeared, along with a driver's license from Illinois. These weren't just fake IDs. They were meticulously crafted, each with its own story, each providing a new layer of mystery. But the most disturbing part was the collection of women's names and photos that accompanied these identities. It became clear that Todd had been living a double life, one that was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. The real breakthrough came when the police discovered a cabin in Wyoming under the name Clint Vassell. It was a modest structure, isolated from the nearest town by miles of dense forest. When the authorities arrived, they found it had been abandoned, though there were clear signs that someone had been living there recently. Inside, the cabin revealed a hidden basement room. The walls were lined with soundproof foam, and there was a steel door that had been bolted shut from the inside. The room was a stark contrast to the rest of the cabin, which had been sparsely furnished. The walls of the basement were covered with photographs, hundreds of them. Some were recent, while others were clearly old, but each photo depicted women, many of whom had been reported missing over the years. Some of the women were familiar to the police. Their disappearances had made headlines across the country. Others were nameless, their faces staring out from the photographs in an unsettling silence. Among these photographs was one that immediately caught the attention of the detectives, a picture of a woman named Irina Calix. She had vanished 8 years ago, leaving behind a grieving family and an unsolved case. The image of Irina was striking. Her face was frozen in a smile that made the detectives shiver. It was as if Todd had been keeping a record of every woman he had taken. The discovery of the cabin only raised more questions. Why had Todd Morgan kept such meticulous records? Was he keeping trophies of his victims, or was he documenting something more sinister? What kind of person could live a double life for so long without anyone noticing? The answers seemed to be slipping further out of reach, with each new discovery adding to the puzzle. The police were left with more questions than answers. Todd Morgan had been hiding a dark secret, but now that secret was beginning to unravel. His life was a complex web of lies, deception, and violence, and someone had gone to great lengths to end it. As the investigation continued, the detectives realized they were not just looking for a murderer. They were hunting down the remnants of a carefully constructed, terrifying life, one that had been built on the pain and suffering of others. As the investigation into Todd Morgan's death deepened, the detectives began to piece together a darker, more twisted story than they had ever expected. The more they uncovered, the more questions arose. Todd had not just been a solitary man with a strange death. He had been living a double life that no one in Maplewood could have imagined. His murder was the final chapter of a story that had begun years earlier, a story filled with deceit, manipulation, and an insidious quest for control. The discovery of Todd's multiple identities was just the beginning. As the police continued to sift through his belongings, they found more than just fake IDs and stolen jewelry. They discovered a series of meticulously kept journals. Each journal detailed his movements, his relationships, and, disturbingly, his interactions with women. The entries were clinical, almost detached, as if Todd had been documenting his life as though he were an observer, not a participant. The journals described how he had moved from town to town, always under a different name. He had learned to manipulate the system, using false identities to rent apartments, secure jobs, and blend in with the people around him. But it wasn't just the false identities that were disturbing. It was the way he had targeted women. According to the journals, Todd had been carefully selecting his victims for years. He would approach them, often posing as someone in need of help, someone they could trust. He would charm them, win their confidence, and then, when they were least expecting it, he would strike. But what made Todd's methods even more chilling was the way he kept track of each woman. In one of the journals, Todd detailed how he had meticulously planned and executed his first abduction. He spoke of the thrill he felt as he watched his victim struggle, of the sense of power that overtook him. The entries became more graphic as time went on, with Todd describing in excruciating detail how he would drug his victims and keep them locked away in remote locations. He would often refer to them as subjects or cases, as if they were nothing more than experiments. The journals also revealed Todd's obsession with control. He had kept every item connected to his victims, from their personal belongings to photos of them taken during their captivity. He even went so far as to create fake identities for them, changing their appearance and their backgrounds to make it harder for anyone to track them. The journals were filled with chilling accounts of how he would discard each woman when he was done with them, leaving behind only their broken lives and the wreckage of his own twisted desires. The deeper the detectives dug, the more they realized how well Todd had covered his tracks. He had carefully planned every move, every step of his life, to avoid detection. He had used his job at the packaging plant as a cover, working night shifts so that he would never raise suspicion. He had kept his apartment tidy and free of personal clutter, making it difficult for anyone to learn anything about his true nature. Even his interactions with neighbors had been carefully measured, with Todd maintaining just enough distance to appear normal, but not enough to form lasting relationships. But there were cracks in Todd's perfect facade, and they began to show as the investigation unfolded. One of the most significant pieces of evidence came when the police discovered a storage unit in Illinois under the name Jared Densmith. Inside, they found a trove of items that further confirmed Todd's dark past. There were more photographs, more jewelry, and more personal effects belonging to women who had gone missing over the years. But what stood out the most was the way Todd had organized everything. Each item was neatly labeled, each woman carefully cataloged in a chilling, almost obsessive manner. As the detectives reviewed the evidence, they began to connect the dots. Todd Morgan had not just been a murderer, he had been a predator who had spent years perfecting his craft. His ability to blend in with society, to hide in plain sight, was terrifying. But what made him even more dangerous was the fact that no one had ever suspected a thing. But amidst the growing horror, there was a glimmer of hope. As the investigation continued, the police discovered that one of Todd's victims had managed to survive. Her name was Valea Rynn, and she had been one of the women whose belongings had been found in Todd's apartment. Valea had been abducted by Todd years earlier, but unlike his other victims, she had managed to escape. She had kept quiet, living in fear for years, too scared to speak out. When Valea saw a news report about the gruesome discovery in Todd's apartment, something inside her snapped. She knew she had to come forward. The moment she did, the police finally had a living witness, someone who could help them understand just how Todd had carried out his reign of terror. Valea's testimony was harrowing. She spoke of how Todd had lured her in with false promises of a job, how he had drugged her and kept her captive for days. She described the horror she had endured, the way Todd had treated her like a mere object, something to be controlled and discarded. With Valea's help, the police began to piece together even more of Todd's life. They learned that Todd had been living off the fear and pain of his victims, building an empire of suffering that spanned years. As the case grew more complex, the detectives realized they were dealing with something far worse than just a murderer. They were facing a monster who had carefully crafted his own twisted version of reality. But despite the mounting evidence, there was still no clear answer as to why Todd had done what he did. What drove him to kill? Was it just a thirst for power? Or something deeper, more insidious? The answer remained elusive, and with it, the true horror of Todd Morgan's life remained hidden in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. The investigation into Todd Morgan's life and crimes had now entered a harrowing new phase. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but the chilling complexity of his existence was becoming clearer with each passing day. The detectives, who had initially believed they were dealing with a single murder, were now confronting the reality of a cold-blooded serial killer who had been operating under their noses for years. What was even more disturbing was the realization that Todd had been a master of deception, carefully crafting a life of normalcy to cover up his sinister activities. The discovery of Valea Rynn, the woman who had survived Todd's twisted game, became a turning point in the case. Valea's testimony was crucial, but the emotional toll of reliving the horror she had endured was immense. She spoke of the isolation, the manipulation, and the terror Todd had instilled in her. Every detail she provided painted a disturbing picture of the methodical way he lured his victims, made them feel safe, and then slowly stripped them of their freedom. She described the basement in the cabin where Todd had kept her, how it was, soundproof and devoid of anything that could give her comfort. Valea's words brought the full extent of Todd's cruelty into sharp focus, and it was clear that this was no ordinary case. Despite Valea's bravery in coming forward, there were still many unanswered questions. The police had yet to uncover the true extent of Todd's network. Each new discovery seemed to open a door to even more horrors. The more they uncovered about his movements, the more they realized just how carefully he had concealed his tracks. It was clear that Todd Morgan had planned for every contingency. His multiple identities were not just a means to evade the law, they were a way to control his victims and keep them isolated. He had used his various personas to create a web of manipulation, always staying one step ahead of those who might try to uncover the truth. The search for Todd's victims continued, and with it, the grim realization that many more women may have fallen prey to his schemes. The photographs found in his cabin, along with the personal items and stolen jewelry, painted a haunting picture of the women he had abducted over the years. Some of them had been reported missing, but their disappearances had never been linked together. Todd had been too careful, too methodical in his actions. He knew how to cover his tracks, how to vanish without leaving a trace. The police knew they had to find the missing women before it was too late. But as the investigation unfolded, they began to uncover the full extent of Todd's depravity. He had not just been a predator, he had been a planner, a man who calculated every move, every detail of his crimes. He had used his factory job as a cover, working long hours at night so that no one would notice his absences. He had avoided close relationships with neighbors, keeping a low profile while quietly stalking his victims. The more they learned about him, the more they realized that Todd had lived a life of careful precision, executing his plans with a chilling level of control. One of the most disturbing aspects of the investigation was the realization that Todd had a network of people who helped him along the way. It wasn't just about his ability to manipulate women, it was about how he had managed to fly under the radar for so long. The police began to uncover evidence that Todd had involved other people in his crimes, individuals who had either unknowingly assisted him or had been complicit in his actions. One of these individuals was a woman named Verity Calloway, a former co-worker from his time at the packaging plant. Verity had never seemed like the type to be involved in something so sinister, but the investigation revealed that she had been in constant contact with Todd, even after he had changed identities. Verity's involvement became clear when the police found several phone records showing repeated calls between her and Todd, as well as evidence that she had visited several of the locations where Todd had kept his victims. What was even more unsettling was the fact that Verity had been unaware of the full extent of Todd's actions. She had been manipulated by him, just as many of his victims had. It was a reminder that Todd's web of control extended far beyond his immediate surroundings, infecting everyone he came into contact with. As the police delved deeper into Todd's past, they discovered that his desire for control had been rooted in his upbringing. Todd had grown up in a broken home, raised by a mother who had been emotionally distant and a father who had been abusive. From an early age, Todd had learned that power and control were the only ways to survive. His life had been a constant struggle for dominance, and over time, this need for control had turned into something far more dangerous. The detectives uncovered evidence that Todd had been arrested for minor offenses in his youth, but each time he had managed to slip through the cracks, avoiding any serious consequences. It seemed that his ability to manipulate the system had been honed over years of practice. He had learned how to cover up his tracks, how to hide in plain sight, and how to escape detection. As the investigation continued to unfold, the detectives were faced with a difficult question. How many more women had Todd victimized over the years? The number of missing women who could potentially be linked to him was growing, and the true scale of his crimes was still unknown. But one thing was clear. Todd Morgan had been living a nightmare that no one had seen coming, and the full extent of his depravity was far worse than anyone had imagined. The case was far from over, and with each new discovery, the detectives knew that they were only scratching the surface of a much larger and more disturbing story. Todd Morgan's life had been one of manipulation and control. But now, the truth was finally coming to light. The more they uncovered, the more they realized how close they had come to losing everything. Todd had been a ghost, a phantom hiding, in plain sight, and now his true nature was being revealed in all its horrifying detail. As the final chapter of the investigation into Todd Morgan unfolded, the scope of his crimes became even more horrifying. The pieces of his life, which had been hidden behind layers of lies, were finally starting to align into a clearer, more chilling picture. The police now understood that Todd had been a master of deception, someone who had carefully concealed his identity and motives for years. But now that they had uncovered the full extent of his actions, they were determined to make sure that the truth was exposed for the world to see. In the weeks following the discovery of the cabin and Valea Rin's testimony, the police were able to track down more of Todd's past victims, and the investigation grew even more complex. It was clear that Todd's crimes spanned not just a few years, but decades. There was a long list of missing women, and though many of them had been written off as cold cases, the police now realized that Todd Morgan had been responsible for their disappearances. Each victim's story had been buried under the weight of time, but now, with the connection between Todd and these women established, the case began to gain national attention. The detectives working on the case were horrified by the depth of Todd's manipulation. He had kept records of his crimes so detailed that it was almost as if he had been compiling a personal manifesto of his reign over the women he had taken. The more they read, the more they realized how methodical and calculated he had been in every step of his criminal activity. From selecting his victims to the way he disposed of them, Todd had been ruthless in his pursuit of control. Yet there was still one piece of the puzzle that eluded them. Why had he chosen to end his own life? The detectives knew that Todd had been found dead in his apartment, the result of a poisoning that had been carefully orchestrated by him. But they could not understand why someone so meticulous, so careful in his planning, would choose to end it all in such a way. Why not continue his reign of terror, staying hidden in the shadows where no one could touch him? It seemed out of character for someone who had spent so long evading the authorities. The answer, when it came, was almost more disturbing than the crime itself. A breakthrough came when the police found a letter among Todd's belongings, a letter that had been addressed to no one in particular. In the letter, Todd confessed to the murders, but not in the way anyone had expected. He didn't express regret, nor did he apologize. Instead, the letter was written in a cold, detached tone. It was as if Todd had been writing a final chapter for himself, a way to document his achievements before slipping out of the world he had so carefully constructed. The letter revealed that Todd had always viewed his crimes as an experiment, something that had to end only when he had reached the limits of his control. In his mind, he had played the game to its ultimate conclusion. Todd's letter explained that he had always known he was superior to others, that the people around him were mere pawns in his grand scheme. He had created a life where he could control everything, from the women he manipulated to the way he disappeared into society unnoticed. He had taken what he wanted, and when it was no longer a challenge, when the thrill of the chase had disappeared, he had decided that his story was finished. His decision to end his life was not a moment of weakness, but rather a way to maintain control even over his death. He had chosen to leave the world on his own terms, a final act in a life built on dominance. The revelation of this letter sent shockwaves through the police force. It was a chilling insight into the mind of a killer who had not only taken lives, but had done so with a disturbing sense of pride. Todd Morgan had not just been a predator. He had been a man who believed he was above the law, above humanity itself. His death was not the tragic end of a man who had been caught. It was the final step in a carefully planned existence that had been about more than just murder. It had been about power, control, and proving his superiority over everyone else. In the aftermath of the case, the town of Maplewood struggled to process the truth. The people who had known Todd Morgan were left reeling, trying to understand how someone they had thought of as a quiet, unremarkable factory worker could have hidden such a monstrous side. Neighbors who had once exchanged pleasantries with Todd now questioned everything about their interactions with him. How could they have been so blind to the darkness lurking beneath the surface? It was a question that would haunt them for years to come. The investigation into Todd's life had revealed not just a killer, but a man who had spent his entire existence manipulating everyone around him. His ability to blend into society, to live a life that seemed ordinary on the outside, had made him nearly invisible. And yet, in the end, it was the very complexity of his double life that had led to his downfall. The investigation, the surviving victims, and the growing number of people who began to come forward with their own stories had unraveled the life of a man who had believed he could escape the consequences of his actions. But in the end, there was no escaping the truth. Todd Morgan's death marked the end of a horrific chapter in the town's history, but the memories of the lives he destroyed would never be forgotten. The survivors, the families of the missing, and the investigators who had worked tirelessly to uncover the truth could now begin to heal, knowing that the monster who had terrorized them for so long was no longer able to hide. The case of Todd Morgan would be remembered not just for the gruesome discovery of his crimes, but for the haunting realization that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who live right next door.